Hey, I know it's been quite some time since I've done a commentary, but hey, we're back at it, and trust me, oh, trust me, do we have a lot to talk about, but that's for another video. But as for now, we're here to talk about the Resident Evil 3 remake, a masterpiece, a monument, a work of art.
Shut up, you ugly!
So unless you're this fucking bigoted imbecile of a fucking wizard who considers an echo chamber of public knowledge art,
I'm a clown.
then feel free to think the remake is art, but I'm here to explain why it was ruined and why it didn't hold significance like the 1999 title Resident Evil 3 Nemesis did. Now I know this video is probably extremely overdue, which leads to the question, why make it? To be honest, I could care less, I'm doing it anyways. Why Resident Evil 3? Because it was the most amazing game to have ever hit my eyes as a child. So many significant memories come from Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. To see one of its core games that boosted Jill's Valentine's status into becoming one of the most recognizable characters of the Resident Evil franchise, this was a terrible mistake by Capcom by putting together a guinea pig of a game that had potential with today's modern technology to become one of the best remakes of the franchise that wasn't an HD collection. Now disclaimer, proceeding forward to easily distinguish which game I will be discussing, I will be referring to the classic as Nemesis, while the newer Resident Evil is the RE3 remake, or the remake, to prevent any type of confusion. I was 7 years old when I played my first ever M-rated game on PlayStation, which would be Resident Evil 3. And as a kid that's 7 years old playing an adult game, that shit was fucking awesome.
You don't want to test his gang stuff.
I remember when my dad brought it home, we sat together in the living room, hooked up the console, and that lovely sound on the screen, and you knew you were in for a shock. That iconic dark sounding intro followed by the disclaimer screen presented by Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. From the graphics of the game, the essence of horror and gore, confusing puzzles, scary sound effects that lingered in our minds as we ventured through the complex camera angles with limited vision. The design of the game was immaculate and honestly incredible with its way of immersing players within the game, with that daunting feeling of excitement, adrenaline, and the feeling of lost hope because of the dangers that Resident Evil had. Nemesis had one of the best soundtracks during the PlayStation era. The iconic RPD music, the QuickTime event music, and the overall immersive soundtrack that really pulls your emotions and fear into the game because we never knew what would happen with Nemesis roaming around. Now in comparison to the remake, I will make an outline of things that quite didn't give it the same nostalgic feeling, or let alone an immersive experience of Resident Evil 3. We will go into each detail as how the game was compared to its predecessor. This is not to say Resident Evil 3 is trash, nor say it is not worth playing. But this perspective is coming from someone who has not only played Nemesis as a child, but has also gone through enough playthroughs and has professionally speedran both Nemesis and the remake. I hope you will all try to understand my perspective and why I truly believe Capcom had ruined a potential masterpiece. Now back then, unless you had played the original Resident Evil 1, you would not know of Jill's significance.
My name Jill?
You would think she was just a female protagonist who had a bad day at work and everything in Raccoon City had went left. Jill's discovery of zombies was not debuted in Nemesis. It was actually in the first, when she had first been with Barry, where she had witnessed her first case of a zombie moving and eating another corpse. You're probably wondering, why does this matter? That was Resident Evil 1. We're talking about Nemesis. And by that you are correct, but this is important in understanding that Jill had already gained poise from her previous experience with the zombies in Resident Evil 1. Hence why she has a firm militant mind in the upcoming ones. Which honestly, I personally adore that. I love that Jill represented a strong woman who didn't just seem like she could do everything by herself. She pretty much acknowledged that she needed the assistance of the team and everybody else, including Carlos, despite her discovering what Umbrella's true motives and agendas were. So with this information, it would be safe to say that Jill is one of the PSX's first iconic female protagonists. Now with there not being in one, but two sequels of Resident Evil in the PSX before Leon's major takeoff in Resident Evil 4 as the poster child of Resident Evil. I hope you guys understand the significance and why I'm explaining this part. What do you mean Leon's a poster child? However, Jill had more presence and impact on Resident Evil before the virus became global. So all in all, Jill had far more biohazard experience than the rest of the Resident Evil cast. So for the remake to have taken away some of the most important cutscenes, dynamics, and everything that existed in Nemesis from the remake is quite depressing. Now the first thing I didn't like about the remake was already the first 5 minutes. It was absolutely horrible. Jill waking up, washes her face, has a prophetic dream, then does it again. Why did I dislike this, you say? First of all, it wasn't even in the original. Therefore, it had no place of existing due to the fact that Resident Evil is literally not magical or anything. In fact, all it is a biohazardous infection that mutates creature DNA to biohazardous weapons. That's it. Like, literally, that's it. So the correlation of her dreams would literally have nothing to do with the game. It didn't put any emphasis on the zombies, no predictions of what would happen. It practically provided zero substance at all. While as in Nemesis, Jill was practically running from zombies in the beginning after a building explosion. So that already was a bad start to how things chronologically happen. Oh, but you think that's stupid? Check this out. Capcom hits you with the fucking Billy Mays, but wait, there's more. The introduction of her being chased from Nemesis as if the guy was a hired fucking hitman in a trash bag heat-seeking Jill like she's in the Terminator made zero fucking sense. Because both introductions were entirely different in their approach to how Jill processed the biohazard attack on Raccoon City. Oh, but it gets even better. So Jill meets Brad. They both begin running away from the mosh pit of zombies. Somehow Brad's dumbass got bit at the door and gets converted. Now Capcom. I'll let a few things slide, but one thing I won't let slide is how in Nemesis, Brad was injured, but no indication of an infection just yet, and his face was decimated by Nemesis at the RPD station where Jill first encounters Nemesis. Do y'all see where I'm going with this? It's like whoever decided to put on the remake project missed the whole movement and didn't even play Nemesis. So not only did Capcom mess up the intro and how bad Brad like even died, they messed up the entire intro. Brad had originally met Jill in the bar in which Jill had to basically have the choice of leaving the bar where either she kills the zombies on his own or Jill had to shoot the zombie herself and grab the lighter, which before you needed that, you also needed to grab the fuel before the door. Pay attention to me mentioning a lighter as to this being very important for my next point. So in Nemesis, Jill meets Nemesis at the RPD station, in which her first encounter where she can choose two decisions, either to fight or flight. While in the remake, we see the clock tower helicopter scene literally reenacted in the beginning, which threw my expectations off entirely on how the intro was going to go. Also, keep in mind for a point I will prove later in the freaking game. The helicopter being shot down was one of the most iconic parts. And for my Nemesis fans, you guys thought after navigating through the clock tower, the game was over. The cutscene showed Jill relaxing, huge sigh of relief once she saw the helicopter coming in to rescue her, in which Nemesis shot it down with a rocket launcher, opening up another series of events that Jill has to endure to beat the game. They took an in-game mechanic and basically brought it to the very beginning of the game. Oh, you heard me correctly. Literally less than 10 minutes into the intro of one of the most iconic scenes was pretty much brought to the very beginning. Oh yes, and it doesn't stop there. So Jill pulls out some Dukes of Hazzard shit and runs Nemesis off the roof with a car. Then Gladbag over here pretty much decides to slowly walk over, and then somehow this motherfucker has the ability to Ultra Instinct a fucking missile from Carlos. Saves Jill and leaves old boy looking like Kanye West in the Jesus Walks video. Completely not the intro any of us was expecting, but I'm a person that's heavy on introductions on games, and there wasn't really an excuse to have changed the introduction manner of Nemesis, remake or not. There could have been so many ways they could have started Jill off and made her iconic. Instead, they gave her a very bland introduction with no substance, while in Nemesis, her introduction felt like a diary to the madness. So remember what I was saying about grabbing the lighter in the fluid? Those gatekeeping mechanics that were hidden? Gatekeeping mechanics, which has been a long-term thing in gaming since the 90s. The inability to access specific zones without keys or key items or alternative routes that it forces a memorization process and a more immersive experience. The mechanic was severely lacking in the remake since you pretty much can just play brain dead through the majority of the intro. This is majorly problematic because everything happening so fast, it doesn't give you time to process anything that's going on. And the game never really gave us many mechanics to gatekeep because you can easily sprint through the majority of the intro without being touched by a zombie. And as a speedrunner myself, I've proven this with many of my friends. Nemesis gave quick time events or QTEs, whatever you weirdos want to call it these days, which gave the experience where number one, you had to make two decisions based on the cutscene or the quick time event that you've triggered. Number two, as you were making through the decision, you were either stuck and Nemesis kept moving, which gave it an even more scary, immersive experience. More of that, you would feel similar to sleep paralysis, sitting in fear, unable to move, but speculating everything that's going on. And number 3, when replayed, you knew what to do and you still got the same effect, but it had a different option which weighs the outcome of how different your endings were. In the remake, there were no alternatives to changing the ending. There aren't any critical changes or decision-making factors. It was a super linear design from beginning to end. And if there were QuakeTime events, which there were like only 2, you couldn't do anything different. Wait a minute, I lied. At the end, if Jill miss aims or doesn't shoot, she gets headshot.
Oh my god!
And to talk about the lack of puzzles. But see, compared to the examples given, there aren't really many interactable things you can do. Versus in Nemesis, you can go outside the restaurant with Carlos, or down the sewers with Carlos. When you do the transformer behind the electric gate, which by the way, these fuckers didn't even implement this, you could use the transformer to open the left or the right door to receive a new weapon and the necessary fuse for the run, which by the way, we won't talk about how the game already had the trains running and we skipped all the necessary items needed to repair the train. But the reason this is highly important is because of the tedious task of gathering items for necessary survival was huge. The movement, the over-the-shoulder experience was great, the dodge mechanics. But with these fast-paced mechanics being added to the game, why remove the core elements? The game was no longer a static camera angle where you had to adjust the character, adjust the angles. So adding mechanics such as finding a combination of items, allowing further exploration of Raccoon City, could have been amazing for the game. They had an entire restaurant, back alley, even stores to work with. But what did they fill it with? Ta-da! They put useless items within it.
Hey, bro, come on now, dawg. Come on, man.
Back then, to access the railway, you had to place the gems within the clock puzzle to even get through. But here's the twist. Remake doesn't even have more than 2 puzzles. The railway, which is so easy a goldfish could do it, and the puzzle with the vaccine, which by the way was way more difficult in Nemesis than this one. It's like the developers had never touched Nemesis. It's mind-boggling how disturbingly easy the remake is. Like, no time wasting mechanics were even added. In Nemesis, there was the RPD locker puzzle, clock puzzle, the transformer puzzle. Oh, and we're not done. The broken crank, gas station puzzle, the Safsprin Adgerville Aqua Cure puzzle, the hospital, the Carlos sliding the cabinet puzzle. Oh no, we're still not done. It's still going. The music box puzzle, the serum puzzle. You're kind of getting my point, right? Like, only 2 of those were implemented from the entire list, which leads to the next question. Why did they take it out? Because the devs were probably lazy, thought that they could get a quick cash grab, not realizing the potential placed in front of them. It's sad how Silent Hill 3 has more puzzles than the new Resident Evil remake. But hey, y'all think art isn't fucking subjective, right? Y'all think because something has a new aesthetic and through a new engine lacks all the experiencing heightened qualities that the previous version did, you call that art, right?
Psych!
Experience is required, right? Then explain the lack of acknowledgement on simple fundamentals that gave the game god tier potential. Stupid! Because in Resident Evil 4, they made moderate changes, but kept virtually everything the same. So it took rock bottom for Resident Evil 3 Remake to make RE4 a banger? All these questions run through my mind because Nemesis was my favorite Resident Evil game of all time. And they hyped it up extremely overboard just for the game to miss 80% of its material. All the Resident Evil 3 enthusiasts, Orchlon, Bobka Pursuit, Pessimism, and many others who've ran the classic Nemesis countless times in record time, yes, in speedruns. Mechanics will be skipped because that's the lack of needing to 100%, which is any percentage, which is a category. However, the gatekeeping mechanics are still implemented because in Splice, there are segments. These were huge to analyze when understanding how fast someone was able to complete a time gamekeeping mechanic. Not all puzzles were ran at the same speed, the same pace, nor the same solution, nor the same RNG, thus giving the game more potential and reasoning to understand the mechanics. To be able to plow through controlled angles, complete puzzles within record time during the PSX era was amazing, because Nemesis didn't have dodge mechanics. Maybe majority of my inputs are based on a Nemesis perspective, but isn't that what a remake is for? To bring back the nostalgic feeling of a game within a new style, engine, and more? It's like Capcom became extremely lazy and thought that they could slap a $60 price tag on a game because they thought it was like the Apple of horror games. Oh, I'm aware my dumb ass bought it, but I was under the impression that the game would live up to the hype and the expectations that Nemesis had left. But as I said, the game had great potential, The fact that you see RPD in a third dimensional over the shoulder view that RE4 invented was amazing. The graphics, the details, many parts of the game were amazing, as well as the characters. It's just the game lacks experience, immersiveness. Hell, even Jill fought a fucking worm in Resident Evil 3, and to be quite honest, Jill was just living through an explosion simulator. Yes, it is cool that you get to fight Nemesis. No, it is not cool that every fight ends in a fucking explosion. It's like the new developers watched the 007 movie and thought to themselves, every cutscene deserves an explosion. And the juiciest part of it all, the unorthodox Nemesis growth program they had going on there. First things first, in Nemesis, the dude never transformed until literally very towards the end. Nemesis began getting stronger and stronger. He grew more tentacles, yes, but he was still humanoid. It wasn't until you killed Nemesis in the acid valve room where the key to get out the room slid out of the scientist's jacket, where you saw him come back towards the end, eat the flesh of the infected in a corner where Nemesis began his final mutation. It was unnecessary how you saw Nemesis on fire, falling into the water next to the side of the bridge.
Bitch can't even swim.
And out comes this four-legged fucking beast like he bathed in the waters of Lake Minnetonka.
You have to purify yourself in the waters of Lake Minnetonka.
And he runs around like a phoenix fox when you fight him in the clock tower. And yes, the very same clock tower Jill should have gotten out of basically when the helicopter was shot down by Nemesis. But nope, he runs around where it's an interesting boss fight. I love that you had limited materials and that you had to basically wait until he was in the phase where he began running before you got anything. But even in this fight wasn't memorable. In fact, it was inaccurate towards the Nemesis version because Nemesis had struck Jill and infected her with his tentacles. First, in the remake, Jill gets infected by a damn thorn. Now, this isn't taking away the credibility that Jill was infected and that they kept the part accurate. It was the principle that Nemesis had never mutated at that point because there was no DNA for him to be able to work with. Therefore, where was the mutation from? But see, all of this could have been more impactful had it been made correctly. Carlos barely held any significance to his role in it, but I will give him props for introducing my man Tyrell. Love to see a brother man out here getting it popping, you know what I'm saying? But Carlos was irrelevant. He held no significant charm like his version where he had puns, funny punchlines, and a flirty sense of humor with Jill, which gave them the game a sense of humanity. Despite Jill and Carlos putting their lives on the line for survival, they built rapport, which is always great to see. Some of his combat playthroughs, such as him defending Jill when she gets knocked out and she has to basically be defended from a horde of zombies, was quite amazing. But if we broke down statistically what happened, Jill was in a church-like looking room, not the hospital. Damn, starting to realize I'm nitpicking a lot of things. But the purpose of why this is being brought up is because the remake was literally almost nothing like the original. The best part about the clock tower was when they made their way to the lab from the clock tower in Nemesis. There was a legit path where you solved the puzzle, even in the water parts and where you make your way to that lab. In the sewers, there were spiders that were creepy, but all the lab was super underground-like. There were scientist zombies, multiple variants of enemies, but not quite the same as the original. So it was a version of its own experience, I guess. Once you make it through the horde of zombies and you grab the cure, you encounter your final fight with Nemesis. And yes, I skipped the acid pit fight because there was nothing significant about that, nor did any event happen in the original, because that never happened. It's garbage and it's a rinse and repeat fight of the clock tower, a lazy attempt at a boss fight. Nemesis begins to fight in his final form, in which you use a ray gun. Me personally, I found nothing challenging about this fight. All you did was shoot Nemesis weak blotches off of its body or whatever little cancerous cells that it had. In the original, you had to kite Nemesis and slide all 3 batteries into the ray gun, and you had to kite Nemesis around until the ray basically had fully charged and destroy the bulbs off its back, so that way you could finally be able to kill it. And when the ray gun was fully charged, you had to make sure that you timed it precisely so that you don't get hit by the beam and that you also are able to target Nemesis and have him walk into the path of it. Which this task is very difficult because during this era there were locked camera angles and the unfamiliarity of where Nemesis was coming from because the angles cut off certain angles of the boxes, so that way you can't be able to see which direction he was actually coming from. While in the remake, I could down Nemesis in literally 1 attempt and get all 3 batteries and end the game. Yep. Jill then runs to the escape, runs into Nikolai and Carlos having be with them, and then she does a little witty exit.
I don't mind a little detective work.
Then boom, the nuke drops, and that's the game. Very cliche fucking ending. So I'm not merely saying the remake doesn't have the rights to make things different, but it doesn't make it alright to have things chronically not make any sense. Certain events not happen that should have happened. But the unnecessary mutations, the lack of the ability to do various endings, the incorrect order of events just leaves a bad taste in the Resident Evil 3 fans' mouths because of the lack of effort put into a classic game that truly launched Jill's presence in the Resident Evil community. Now with the re-debuted in RE5, nobody sees her the same as she was in 3, in which hoping we could get some backstory. Resident Evil 2, Claire is now slowly becoming a rising star for the favorite female protagonist of the Resident Evil series with fewer debuts than Jill. Not that Claire wasn't amazing, but chronologically this would make more sense for Jill considering she was in Resident Evil 1. Nonetheless, Jill lacked much of her amazing qualities that she carried from the older Resident Evils into this remake. It was a very linear game, minimal effort, and Capcom should take a huge lesson from this that having a huge reputation doesn't excuse the lack of effort that you should be putting into games like this. If they do Resident Evil 5 as awfully as they did 3, me being a 1999 Resident Evil enthusiast will never support this series ever again. I know this video may be seeming like I'm talking about a lot of Capcom's failures with the remake, but there's one thing they did correct. Remember that weirdo in the beginning of Nemesis in the remake where he ran into the container denying Jill's assistance and saying that he'd rather starve to death than be eaten by the zombies outside? Well, either version, that weird motherfucker didn't even die to the zombies. He took a nail to the nuke dropped in the city. Like, imagine decreasing your odds of surviving to 0% because you chose not to go with Jill. Like, legit, this man went into the container, he said nah. Instead of taking that 70% survival chance, he dies. So, at least Capcom did one thing correct.
Keep it up, I'm a nigga.
Fight!